Section 11. St. Benedict's, of course, has always had a more profound effect than most schools on the lives of its students. Yet, nonetheless, it was strange that once in the center of the pond, where he had rowed us with his lurching stroke, Martin Blythe set down the oars in their locks and told me he had something he'd always meant to ask me. Yes, I said. He brushed back his hair with his hand. I was supposed to be the one up there with Deepak and Fred, wasn't I, sir? Don't tell me you're still thinking about that. It's just that I've sometimes wondered what happened. Yes, you should have been, I said. Oh, how little we understand of men if we think that their childhood slights are forgotten. He smiled. He did not press the subject further, and while I myself debated the merits of explaining why I had passed him over for Cedric Bell 41 years before, he pivoted the boat around and brought us back to shore. The confirmation of his suspicions was enough to satisfy him. It seemed so. I said nothing more. He had been an Air Force major in our country's endeavors on the Korean peninsula. Yet, as he pulled the boat onto the beach, I had the clear feeling of having saved him from some torment. Indeed, that evening, when the guests had gathered in the lodge's small theater, and Deepak Mehta, Fred Mazzoudi, and Cedric Bell had taken their seats for the reenactment of Mr. Julius Caesar, I noticed an ease in Martin Blythe's face that I believe I had never seen in it before. His brow was not knit, and he had crossed his legs so that above one sock we could clearly see the painted wooden calf. It was then that I noticed that the boys who had paid the most attention to me that day were in fact the ones sitting before me on the stage. How dreadful a thought this was, that they had indulged me to gain advantage. But I put it from my mind and stepped to the microphone. I had spent the late afternoon reviewing my notes, and the first round of questions were recalled from memory. The crowd did not fail to notice the feat. There were whistles and stomps when I named 15 of the first 16 emperors in order and asked Fred Mazzoudi to produce the one I had left out. There was applause when I spoke Caesar's words, Il jacta alea esto, and then continuing and carefully pronounced Latin, asked Cedric Bell to recall the circumstances of their utterance. He had told me that afternoon of the months he had spent preparing, and as I was asking the question, he smiled. The boys had not worn togas, of course, although personally I feel they might have, yet the situation was familiar enough that I felt a rush of unease as Bell's smile then waned, and he hesitated several moments before answering. But this time, 41 years later, he looked straight out into the audience and spoke his answers with the air of a scholar. It was not long before Fred Mazzoudi had dropped out, of course, but then, as it had before, the contest proceeded neck and neck between Cedric Bell and Deepak Mehta. I asked Cedric Bell about Caesar's battles at Pharsalus and Thapsus, about the shift of power to Constantinople, and about the war between the patricians and the plebeians. I asked Deepak Mehta about the Punic Wars, the conquest of Italy, and the fall of the Republic. Deepak, of course, had an advantage, for certainly he had studied this material at university, but I must say that the straightforward determination of Cedric Bell had begun to win my heart. I recalled the bashful manner in which he had shown me his flashcards at dinner the night before, and as I stood now before the microphone, I seemed to be in the throes of an affection for him that had long been under wraps. What year were the Romans routed at Lake Trasimene? I asked him, and he paused. 217 BC, I believe. Which general later became Scipio Africanus Major? Publius Cornelius Scipio, sir, Deepak Mehta answered softly. It does not happen as often as one might think that an unintelligent boy becomes an intelligent man. From my own experience, the love of thought is rooted in an age long before adolescence. Yet Cedric Bell now seemed to have done just that. His answers were spoken with the composed demeanor of a scholar. There is no one I like more, of course, than the man who is moved by the mere fact of history. And as I contemplated the next question, Tim, I wondered if I had indeed exaggerated the indolence of his boyhood. Was it true, perhaps, that he had simply not become into his element yet while at St. Benedict's? He peered intently from the stage, his elbows on his knees. I decided to ask him a difficult question. Chairman Bell, I said, which tribes invaded Rome in 102 BC? His eyes went blank, and he curled his shoulders in his suit. Although he was by then one of the most powerful men in America, and although moments before that I had been rejoicing in his discipline, suddenly I saw him on that stage once again as a frightened boy. How powerful is the memory! And once again, I feared that it was I who had betrayed him. He brought his hand to his head to think. Take your time, sir, I offered.